I wasn't supposed to be there that day. That's the thing nobody tells you about moments that stay with you forever. They almost didn't happen. You almost took a different street. You almost slept in. You almost chose the coffee shop on the other side of the city, but something pulls you, and you go, and then you're standing exactly where you need to be standing when the world decides to do something. You'll spend years trying to explain to people who weren't there. It was a Tuesday. Early, October, one of those London mornings where the sky can't make up its mind. Gray and heavy one minute, then a thin slice of pale gold pushing through between the clouds the next. The kind of morning that smells like wet stone and old leaves and something else, something harder to name, like the city itself is exhaling after a long night. I'd been in London for 6 days, visiting my sister who lives in Pimlico and doing the usual things, museums, markets, walking until my feet stopped cooperating. That morning she had a work call that ran long, and I didn't feel like waiting around in her flat, so I grabbed my coat and walked. No plan. Pretty much, just walked. Ended up near the palace, the way you always do in that part of London. It's like the streets tilt slightly toward it, like even the city itself can't help orienting around the place. I'd done the tourist walk past the gates a couple of times earlier in the week, taken the obligatory photos, watched the guards, and felt that strange mix of awe and awkward self-consciousness that you get when you're photographing a real person who isn't allowed to react to being photographed. But that Tuesday morning felt different from the moment I turned onto the mall. There weren't many people yet, and too early for most tourists, and the commuters had already done their rush. A handful of joggers, a woman walking a pair of dogs that were far too well behaved for their own dignity. A man in a long coat reading something on his phone without looking up, navigating the path entirely by instinct. The plane trees lining the mall still had most of their leaves, deep green going brown at the edges, and they made a sound in the breeze that was almost like applause. Not quite, but almost. I stopped near the Victoria Memorial, the big white monument just outside the palace gates, and did what everyone does. Looked at the gold figure on top. Actually thought vaguely about history. Watched, honestly. A pigeon do something deeply unbothered on the arm of an angel. The guards were at their posts, the ones in the famous red tunics and tall black bearskin hats, standing in their sentry boxes at the front, motionless in the way that takes a kind of discipline most people don't have. Not just physical stillness, but something more complete. A refusal to register the world unless the world gives them a very specific reason to. I've always found them fascinating in a way I can't fully articulate. Not because of the uniform or the ceremony, but because of what's required of a person to be that still, that present, but invisible, that on duty, but on the surface entirely absent. I guess was looking at one of them, the guard on the left of the main gate, when I noticed the first thing that felt off. Actually, and he was standing differently, not dramatically differently, not in any way that would have been obvious to most people walking past, but I'd been standing there for maybe 10 minutes by then, long enough to have calibrated my sense of what still looked like in these guards, and this one was slightly more still than that, if that makes any sense. Like, honestly, someone had turned the dial one notch past normal. His hands, which should have been at his sides in that rigid, formal position, were fractionally tighter, the kind of tightness you see in someone's jaw when they're holding something in. I guess, thought, he's cold. Reasonable explanation. Early October, wind picking up. Basically, I kept watching. A small group of tourists arrived from my left, 4 of them, Australian accents. Or the kind of cheerful directness that Australians have that I've always admired. They took photos. One of them tried to get a reaction from the guard by pulling a face 3 inches from his peripheral vision. The guard didn't react. Plus, the Australians laughed, took more photos, moved on. The guard remained unchanged. Except, not entirely. His eyes had moved. Just, I think, slightly, which not toward the Australian who'd been making faces, in the other direction, toward the inner courtyard. I followed that line of sight without really meaning to. There was movement inside the gates that I couldn't fully see. Figures, vehicles, the kind of coordinated activity that suggested something was either arriving or preparing to arrive. The palace has its own rhythms, its own internal weather systems of protocol and preparation, and from the outside you usually can't read them. But something was happening. You could feel it the way you feel a stage before the curtain goes up, the air pressurized with held breath. Then a car appeared inside the courtyard, dark, sleek, moving slowly in that way that official vehicles move when they're making sure everyone has time to clear the path. A Range Rover, I thought, though from where I was standing I couldn't be entirely certain. Windows dark, I guess moving toward the inner gate. The guard I'd been watching, still in his box, still technically motionless, had gone even more rigid. I mean, not with fear, with something more complicated, something I didn't have a word for yet but would spend the rest of the day turning over in my mind. I sort of got out my phone, not because I was trying to capture something, more because having it in my hand felt like a reason to stay, a justification for standing in one place long enough to see what happened next. The camera was open, but I wasn't really pointing it at anything, just holding it, plus watching. The car, TBH, stopped. There was a long pause, the kind that in a film would have music under it, something low and careful, building. A door opened on the far side of the vehicle. A figure got out, then another. I couldn't see who they were from where I was standing. Too much distance, too much gate between us, and the morning light was coming from behind them, making everyone on that side of the courtyard a silhouette. But the way the other figures around the car moved, the slight adjustment of posture, the almost, this imperceptible shift toward attention, told me that whoever had stepped out of that vehicle was someone who mattered. The tourists around me had noticed something too. The Australians had drifted back. A Japanese couple with a professional camera had appeared as if from nowhere. 3 teenagers who'd been sitting on the memorial steps eating breakfast, put their food down. None of us said anything to each other. We were all just watching. And then I heard the voice, which I should be clear. I didn't hear words, not clearly, not from that distance. What I heard was the quality of a voice. A woman's voice, carrying more than the volume suggested it should, the kind of voice that doesn't need to be raised because it's never, in its entire life, needed to be raised to be heard, as authoritative in the way that only people who have been genuinely, unquestionably, structurally authoritative for decades can be. Not unkind, but absolutely certain. And something, I guess, in the movement of the figures inside the courtyard changed. The guard in the sentry box, my guard, the one I'd been watching, moved for the first time. Just his head, a slight turn, controlled, formal, but undeniably a response to something. And in the fraction of a second that his face moved through my line of sight, I saw something in his expression that I still think about. Actually, not fear, not confusion. Something more specific than either of those things. The look of a man who has just been given an order that he doesn't understand, from someone who has every right to give it, and who is now engaged in the purely internal battle of whether to obey the thing that was said or the thing that was meant. For what it's worth, I lowered my phone. This, I thought, was going to be something. I was right. The crowd around the gates had thickened by then. Not dramatically, maybe 30 people where there had been 10, but enough that I'd to shift my position slightly to maintain my line of sight. I moved left along the outer edge of the memorial, found a spot on the low stone barrier where I could see both the main gate and the sentry boxes without anyone's head directly in my way. The woman with the 2 dogs had stopped walking and was watching with the same focused attention as everyone else. Her dogs, I think, sat beside her with matching patience, as if they too understood that something was happening. There inside the courtyard, the reconfiguration of figures continued. Whatever had been set in motion by that voice, that clear, certain, quietly commanding voice, was now visibly in progress. I could see two men in plain dark suits, moving with the purposeful briskness of people who have received instructions and are executing them. Not running. No one was running, but moving with a speed and direction that was unmistakably official. They were moving toward the guard. The guard I'd, in my opinion, been watching. He was still in his box, still technically at attention. But there was something in his posture now that was different from anything I'd seen in any royal guard, in any visit to any palace in any country, a quality of presence that wasn't quite stillness anymore, more like a tree in wind, and unmoving but not untouched. Irrooted, but aware of what was moving through, the two men in suits reached the gate. Words were exchanged. I couldn't hear them, but I could see the conversation from its physical grammar. One of the suited men gesturing, the guard's response being almost nothing, almost no movement at all, but somehow entirely legible from 50 meters away. He wasn't going to step out of that box. Not yet. Not without something, some further instruction, some clarification, which something. And the suited man, to his credit, didn't push it. He stepped back, touched his earpiece. His expression was the expression of someone relaying a message upward while standing very still and hoping the answer comes back quickly. The Japanese couple beside me were speaking quietly in Japanese. The woman was filming. The man had his hand on her arm. Not restraining, just connected. The gesture of two people sharing something surprising without wanting to break the spell of it. I thought about the guard's face again. That expression. I've been trying to find the right word for it since that morning, and I keep coming back to the same one, even though it feels too large for the situation, too weighty. But I keep coming back to it, because it's the only one that fits. TBH, the word is integrity. Not in the abstract sense, not the word we use when we mean someone is basically honest. The older sense, actually the structural sense, the sense of a thing that has been built around a core principle so completely that to remove it wouldn't just alter the thing, it would end it. A bridge has integrity when every part of it's in the right relationship with every other part. When you compromise that relationship, you don't get a changed bridge. You get a collapse. This man had been placed in his sentry box according to a set of rules and traditions and protocols that had been handed to him and that he had accepted entirely. He wasn't just standing there. He was standing there as a function of something larger than himself, something that had its own structure and its own logic. To step out of that position on the instruction of someone, even someone of considerable authority, who didn't have the specific procedural authority to move him, wasn't simply disobedience. It was, from his perspective, structurally impossible. And the woman whose voice had started all of this, I hadn't seen her yet, not clearly, not enough to be certain of who she was. Although the crowd around me was beginning to have opinions about that, murmured ones, tentative ones, clearly felt differently. A second voice joined the situation, male, quieter. From somewhere deeper inside the courtyard, somewhere I still couldn't see clearly, everything stopped. When I say everything stopped, I mean it in the literal physical sense. The two suited men near the gate stopped moving. The figures in the courtyard stopped moving. Plus, the guard, my guard, the one I'd been watching since the beginning of all this, stopped in whatever internal motion he'd been engaged in, the barely perceptible shift of someone deciding something, and returned to absolute stillness. Even the tourists around me went quiet. Not because they'd heard the voice, most of them hadn't, it wasn't loud enough to carry over the ambient noise of the city, but because they could feel the quality of the pause. When everyone in a scene stops, the people watching the scene stop too. It's involuntary. Like, in my opinion, holding your breath because someone else held theirs. The woman with the dogs looked at her dogs. They were still sitting perfectly. She looked back at the gate. I became very aware of the sound of my own breathing. Then the suited man nearest to the gate touched his earpiece again, listened for several seconds, and did something I didn't expect. He stepped back, not one step but three, and turned to face away from the sentry box, facing inward, toward the courtyard. The posture of someone who is now waiting, not directing. Whatever instruction had come through that earpiece, it wasn't proceed. It was something else entirely. Let me, I think, tell you what I knew by that point, and what I didn't. What I knew, something unusual had happened. An order had been given by that clear, authoritative female voice to move the guard from his post. The order had been in the process of being executed. And then something had intervened. A second voice, male, quieter, carrying a different kind of weight, not louder but somehow more final. The intervention, of that voice had paused everything. What I didn't know, who basically was involved. I'd suspicions. The murmuring of the people around me had coalesced around a name, the way crowd suspicions do, not as confirmed fact. As a kind of collective hypothesis that everyone was testing against what they could see. But from where I stood, and I hadn't had a clear sight line to the figures beyond the gate. Shadows and silhouettes and the particular way morning light flattens things at a distance had kept me from being certain. What kind of, I did know from the reaction of every official inside that courtyard, was that the second voice outranked the first, and that the second voice had said, in effect, stop. I found out later, through various accounts, through things that emerged over the following days, through people with better sight lines than mine, through the particular way that stories like this travel in London, quietly and in fragments that slowly assemble, more of the shape of what had happened. But standing there in the October morning, what I'd was the pure experience of watching something play out in the grammar of bodies and gestures and posture, and without the benefit of knowing the words. And honestly, that might have been better, and because what I was watching, stripped of specifics, was something genuinely human and genuinely interesting. A disagreement, plus a real one. Between people who didn't disagree in public as a rule, playing out in front of a gate in front of strangers, mediated by a protocol system so elaborate and so deeply embedded that even the disagreement had to happen inside it and around it rather than through it. The suited man who had stepped back was still waiting, still facing inward. A figure was moving toward the gate from the inner courtyard. Moving with, I think, deliberate slowness. Not the slowness of age or uncertainty, but the slowness of intention, the slowness of someone who has decided how this moment is going to go. And the tourists around me had their phones up, all of them. The Japanese couple. The Australians who had reappeared, which a man I'dn't noticed before, older, standing very close to my left with a decent camera, who had the calm, focused energy of someone who has spent a long time photographing things that might not happen twice. I didn't raise my phone. I'm not sure why. I think I was too invested in seeing this with my own eyes to want the mediation of a screen. There's something like that happens when you look through a camera lens. It's a kind of distance, a management of the experience. I didn't want to manage this. I wanted to be inside it. And the figure reached the inner side of the gate. It was a man. Actually, older. Not tall. But carrying himself in the way that people carry themselves when they've spent a long time understanding that physical presence is only one of several kinds of presence available to a person, and it may not be the most important one. He was wearing, I'm being deliberately imprecise here because I'm a person who was standing 50 meters away in an early morning light, not a fashion correspondent. Something dark and relatively informal, the way someone dresses when they're moving through their own home rather than presenting themselves to the public. He looked at the sentry box. The guard looked at, well, and the guard did what guards do. He looked at nothing. In that specific, practiced, total focus on nothingness, that's one of the most demanding and underappreciated disciplines in British public life. And the man at the gate said something. I couldn't hear it, couldn't lip-read it, but I saw it land. The two suited men, both of them, the one near the gate, and a second I'd noticed positioning himself further along the fence, moved, in the other direction, away from the sentry box, back toward the inner courtyard, which one of them touched his earpiece again and said something brief. The guard remained, at his post, plus, in his box, where I think he had been placed and where he was meant to be, and the man at the gate, the second voice, the quieter one, the one that outranked, did something that I keep coming back to because it feels significant in a way I can't fully explain. He nodded. Like not to the crowd, not to the cameras. There was no performative quality to it, no awareness of being observed. It was directed entirely at the guard. At this one specific young man in his red tunic and tall hat who had spent the last several minutes being instructed to leave his post and had, through some quiet internal machinery of principle and discipline, simply declined to do it until the right person told him the right thing. The nod was, I'm going to use a word that might sound too large, but I keep reaching for it. Respectful. Uncomplicated and direct and respectful. The guard gave no visible response, and he wasn't meant to. That wasn't the basically form, but something in the absolute quality of his stillness shifted very slightly, the way a breath changes when a held tension releases. The man at the gate turned and walked back into the courtyard. And that was it. The crowd around me exhaled as one organism. Someone laughed, kind of, not mockingly, more the laugh of relief, of tension released in a form the body reaches for when it needs somewhere to put something. The Australians were talking to each other with the rapid animation of people processing something surprising. The man with the camera lowered it and looked at his screen with an expression of either satisfaction or uncertainty, I couldn't tell which. The woman with the dogs was the first person to simply turn, walk away, continuing for what it's worth, her mourning as if this had been a reasonable and expected thing to witness. I admired that. Her dogs went, in my opinion, with her, still impeccably behaved. I stayed. I stayed because I wasn't done thinking about it yet. The guard was standing exactly as he had been standing when I first arrived. Red tunic. Actually, a tall hat. Look, hands at his sides. Plus, eyes focused on nothing and everything. The sentry box behind him like a frame, like he was a painting in a gallery that someone had briefly thought about moving and then returned to its proper wall. He pretty much would stand there for hours more, and then he would be relieved by another guard, in the elaborate choreography of the changing of the guard, and he would march away down the path in perfect step with people who had no idea what had happened, what had almost happened, what had been asked of him, and what he had quietly, without drama, without ever breaking form, refused. I started walking back toward the mall, then stopped. I turned around and looked at him one more time. He was absolutely still. I thought about what that costs a person, not just physically. The obvious cost. Well, the hours on your feet, the aching muscles, the discipline of your body. But the other kind of cost. The cost of being a living embodiment of something larger than yourself, of having agreed to be the visible surface of a tradition so old, so layered, I think, with meaning that you're never, in any meaningful sense, simply yourself in those hours. You are the thing you represent, and to be the thing you represent fully and without compromise, even when powerful people want you to be something else, even for just a moment, even just to make a situation easier. That's not a small thing. That is, in its quiet way, its own kind of courage. I put my phone in my pocket, turned back toward the mall, started walking, and behind me, and the palace hummed with whatever internal reckoning was happening inside its old walls. Whatever conversation was being had, whatever equilibrium was being restored between people who lived at a distance from most of human experience, but weren't, in the end, exempt from it. In front of me, London continued to be London. Traffic. Plus, coffee shops opening their shutters. A bus going past with an advertisement for something cheerful and entirely unrelated to any of this. A man on a bicycle with a full bag of groceries managing the handlebars with the casual expertise of someone who has done this particular urban balancing act 1,000 times. Normal life. Carrying on. I walked another 100 meters before I realized I was smiling. I called my sister when I got back. Not immediately. I sat in a small cafe on Buckingham Palace Road first. Had I guess, coffee, and tried to organize what I'd seen into something coherent, which proved difficult because coherent wasn't quite the shape of it. What I'd seen was coherent, certainly. Things had happened in an order that made sense. Causes had produced effects. A situation had arisen and been resolved. But the meaning of it was less tidy than that. The meaning of it kept shifting when I looked at it directly, the way certain things do. I told my sister. She listened with the quality of attention she gives things when she thinks they might be important, which is different from her regular listening quality in subtle ways I've learned to read over 30 years of being her sibling. "So Camilla wanted to move one of the guards," she said, "and Charles stopped it." "I think so," I said. "I can't be certain of who it was. The crowd thought so. The way everyone in the courtyard behaved suggested so. But I was 50 meters away and the light wasn't great. Why would she want to move him?" I didn't know. I'd been thinking about that since it happened, and I still didn't know. There are any number of reasons why someone might want a guard repositioned, logistics of a vehicle's path, sight lines for security, some protocol requirement that had come up unexpectedly. It didn't have to be anything dramatic. Most things that look dramatic from the outside have entirely reasonable explanations from the inside. But the basically way it had played out, the speed of the intervention, the quality of the second voice, the nod, suggested that the reason wasn't purely logistical, and that something more complex had been at work. Some tension, however minor, however quickly resolved, between a preference and a principle. "I don't know why," I told my sister. "I only know for what it's worth what I saw." She was quiet for a moment. "And the guard just stayed?" "He just stayed." Another pause. "Good," she said. Simply, without elaboration. I think that's the right word for it. Good. 3 days later, I was back home in the different light and different rhythm of a different city. The thing I'd seen outside Buckingham Palace on that Tuesday morning was still with me. This happens sometimes. You experience something and your mind files it away in the ordinary folder, the one marked "Interesting Things I Saw While Traveling," and you expect it to stay there, categorized and settled. But sometimes it doesn't stay. Sometimes it keeps climbing back out of the folder and sitting on your desk and waiting for you to look at it again. This was one of those. I kept returning to different parts of it. The guard's face, that brief glimpse of it. That expression I'd called integrity, the word that felt too large but kept being the right one. The sound of the first voice, the quality of its certainty, the pause that the second voice created, and the nod. The 3 backward steps of the suited man. And I kept returning to something else, and something I hadn't focused on in the moment, but that kept surfacing when I went back over the memory. The reaction of the people around me. Not the tourists with their phones. That reaction was understandable and expected, the reflex of a generation that processes experience partly through documentation. Not the man with the camera, who had his own professional reasons for being there and his own professional relationship to what he'd witnessed. Honestly, but the others. The woman with the dogs, which the way she'd watched with total stillness, her dogs patient beside her, and then simply turned and continued her walk without a word, without any visible processing, as if she'd seen something that confirmed rather than surprised. As kind of if the thing that had happened wasn't remarkable to her, but right, expected, the world working the way it should. Look, the Australians, their rapid animated conversation afterward. I'd caught a few words of it, walking past them before I moved out of earshot. And the phrase I'd caught was, "Did you see his face?" Not, "Did you see what happened?" Not, "Do you know who that was?" Just, "Did you see his face?" Someone had been watching the guard's face. Someone else had seen what I'd seen. The older man actually with the camera, lowering it to look at his screen, I'd been uncertain in the moment whether his expression was satisfaction or uncertainty. Thinking about it later, I decided it was neither. It sort of was the expression of someone who has been working for a long time and has just unexpectedly captured something they didn't know they were looking for. And the Japanese couple, the woman still filming, the man with his hand on her arm, the hand on the arm that wasn't restraint, but connection. The two of them sharing something without needing to discuss it. 30 people, roughly. So on a Tuesday morning outside a palace. From different countries, different languages, different relationships to the history and significance of the place they were standing in front of. Most of them, TBH, had never met and would never meet. They sort of had no shared context beyond the accident of being in the same spot at the same time. And they had all stopped, which they had all felt it. I've thought about basically why a quiet, low-drama, quickly resolved situation outside a gate on an ordinary London morning would create that kind of shared attention. Nothing violent had happened. Plus, nobody had been hurt. No rules had been broken. The outcome was, in the grand scheme of things, minor. A guard stayed at his post. This happens every day. Every guard who has ever stood at every post has, by definition. I stayed at it. That is the job. But this was different, and I think everyone watching felt it was different, and I've been trying to identify what made it different. I actually think it comes down to something simple. We live in my opinion, a world where authority flows very easily downward, where someone with institutional power asking someone with less institutional power to do something is an event so unremarkable that it barely registers. It's the background radiation of organized society. It happens basically 1,000 times a day in offices and schools and hospitals and government buildings and courts of law, and the usual result is that the person with less power does the thing the person with more power has asked them to do, because that's how institutions function, and because the costs of not doing it are generally higher than the costs of doing it. This isn't cynicism. It's just how things work. And mostly how things work is fine. Mostly the person asking has a reasonable reason, and the person complying isn't harmed by complying. The whole transaction is forgotten before either of them reaches the end of the corridor. But sometimes, rarely, but sometimes, something else happens. Sometimes the person with less institutional power has a different kind of authority, not louder, not backed by rank or position, but rooted in something that the institutional authority can't quite reach because it exists at a different level, the level of role, of form, of the, in my opinion, specific and irreplaceable function that only you can perform in this moment by being exactly where you're and not moving. And when those two kinds of authority meet, the institutional kind, which can be loud and certain and backed by all the weight of rank. The other kind, which is quiet and almost invisible but completely immovable. What you get is the thing I watched through the gate that Tuesday morning. A pause. A genuine pause in the machinery of how things work. The institutional authority said, "Move," which the other authority said, without words, without drama, without any breakdown of form or protocol. I can't. Not because I won't. Because I'm the function you placed me here to perform, and the function requires that I be here, and only the specific person who has the authority to end that function can end it. And you're that person, I mean not defiantly. Plus, not with any visible awareness of what he was doing. Just simply, structurally, as a fact of how things were arranged. And then the specific person who did have the authority arrived and understood immediately and said, "Stop." One word. Maybe not even that. A gesture. A look. I guess a nod. Kind of. Enough. I've been thinking about what kind of person you've to be to do what that guard did. Not heroically. Not because I think it was a heroic act. I've thought carefully about that, and I don't think heroism is the right category for it. Heroism implies a choice in the face of danger, a sacrifice, a cost. What the guard did wasn't that. He honestly wasn't risking anything, not really. He was simply being what he was supposed to be. But that's not as simple as it sounds. To be simply and completely what you're supposed to be in the face of clear institutional pressure to be something else. For however briefly from someone with considerable standing, that requires a specific quality that I don't think we talk about enough. Not stubbornness. Stubbornness is reactive, personal, emotional. What I saw was none of those things. Not blind, pretty much. Obedience to rules. Blind obedience to rules would have produced the opposite outcome. He would have stepped aside because the person asking was significant, and significance is a kind of rule. He didn't do that either. What he had was something more precise, a complete understanding of his own function, not arrogant, not rigid, I guess just clear. A clarity so complete that it couldn't be dislodged by anything except the thing that was actually authorized to dislodge it. I think about that quality sometimes in my ordinary life, far from palaces and gates and the elaborate choreography of royal protocol. I think about how rarely most of us have it, how often we're talked out of our own clarity by pressure that's even hostile, just confident. How often someone who seems more certain than we're in the moment causes us to doubt a thing we actually knew. How often we step out of our own proper position, the one we were placed in and accepted and know how to fill, because someone with a louder voice suggested we should. The guard didn't TBH do that. Plus, to be fair, I find that more interesting than anything else I saw that morning. Well, there's a moment in the memory that I keep returning to, above all the others. Not the nod, not the voice, not the 3 backward steps of the suited man. The moment I keep returning to is earlier, before any of that had happened. When I was first watching the guard and had noticed that he was standing differently, that one notch past normal stillness, that fractional tightening, that quality of being rooted but aware of what was moving through. Because in that moment, he already knew. He had already received the instruction, or the approach of the instruction, or whatever the specific form of this particular palace's particular protocol was by which such things arrived. And he was already, in his own quiet, private, unverifiable internal way, dealing with it, and not deciding, and he knew what he was going to do, but processing. The processing that happens when you know the right thing and the difficult thing are the same thing, and you're about to have to be the kind of person who does them. Most of that processing is invisible. It happened entirely inside a young man in a ceremonial uniform standing in a box outside a gate on a Tuesday morning in October. One saw it happen. The people I mean walking past didn't see it. The tourists, in my opinion, taking photos didn't see it. Most of the crowd that gathered later didn't see it. I only saw it because I happened to be watching at the right moment, from a position that gave me a decent enough angle, at a time of morning when the light was doing something useful and the crowd was thin enough that nothing was blocked. That's all. I just luck of position, luck of timing. But I saw it, and that's the thing about moments like this, the ones that stay with you. They don't stay because they were the biggest things that happened. They stay because they were true things, because some piece of actual human reality was briefly visible through all the layers of performance and protocol and managed impression that usually cover it. And you happened to be in exactly the right place to see it, and it confirmed something you half believed but couldn't quite prove, that people under pressure sometimes know exactly who they are, and choose to be that, and I told this story to a friend, About a week after I got back. She's a historian, which means she's a professionally complicated relationship to stories about royalty and ceremony and what they mean. And I expected her to complicate it, to give me context that would reframe it, to point out things I'd missed or I guess misread, to bring the machinery of academic skepticism to bear on what I'd experienced as something quietly significant. She didn't do that. She listened all the way through, asked a couple of clarifying questions about what I'd seen and heard, and then sat quietly for a moment with her wine. "You, to be fair, know what strikes me," she said, "is that it worked." I waited. Every basically protocol, every tradition, every elaborate system of form and hierarchy that they've built up over centuries, all of it came down to this one moment where someone with a lot of authority said move, and someone with a different kind of authority said no, and then someone with the specific right kind of authority said stop, and everyone stopped. She paused. And it worked, the way it TBH was supposed to, which the whole system just held. She turned her wine glass in her hands. "That doesn't happen as often as you'd think," she said. "Systems that are supposed to hold, holding." I thought about that for a long time after I left her house that night. Walking home through, I guess, streets that were different from London. Streets but lit by the same general darkness, the same general spill of city light. The for what it's worth. My same general mixture of the people who are still out at that hour and the evidence of the people who have already gone in. Systems that for what it's worth are supposed to hold, holding. Not because anyone designed them perfectly, not because everyone in them is perfect, but because enough people inside them at enough crucial moments decide, quietly, without fanfare, without any particular awareness of how it looks from the outside, to be exactly what they are supposed to be. No more than that. But also, no less. I've been back in London once since then. Different season, different purpose, which I walked past the palace one morning. Couldn't help it, the streets do tilt that way. And stood for a few minutes at the outer edge of the memorial the way I'd in October. The guards were at their posts. A different guard in the sentry box on the left. Younger looking, or maybe just unfamiliar, or maybe I was projecting. Standing in the particular complete stillness, that's an absence but presence. Eyes focused on kind of the middle distance in that way, that's an unfocused but a different kind of focus. Tourists were taking photos. One of them tried to get a reaction by standing very close and pulling a face. The guard didn't react. In my opinion, he was simply there, doing the one specific thing he had been placed there to do, with the complete attention that it deserved, against the backdrop of a city that moved and shifted and generated noise and urgency and news every second of every day all around him. I watched him for a few minutes. Plus, then I turned and walked away, back into the ordinary morning. The thing about standing your ground, I thought, is that most of the time, nobody sees it. Most of the time, the pressure comes quietly and the holding is quiet, and the whole thing resolves without anyone outside knowing it happened. The machinery works, the protocols hold, the right person says the right thing at the right moment, and tomorrow the guard comes back and stands in the same spot, and the city continues and the tourists take their photos and nobody has any reason to think about what it means. That's how it's supposed to go. Plus, that Tuesday morning in October, I happened to see it. I'm still glad I went for that walk.